Okay, so we're going to have a look at the extract from De Profundis by Oscar Wilde, and first of all we need to have a think about the gap, which is a little bit more complicated than it is for lots of the other texts in the anthology. Okay, so contextually you also need to be aware that Oscar Wilde is imprisoned for 2 years, so he gets 2 years hard labour, and that's because of his convicted homosexuality and his relationship with Bosie. It's worth watching the Stephen Fry film if you haven't seen it, just to get a kind of sense of Oscar Wilde's life, but I will kind of briefly summarise for you. So Bosie is his lover, he's a lord, but Bosie's father is very much against their relationship and very much kind of out to get Wilde, and him and his son have a very tempestuous relationship. Bosie unfortunately leaves love letters from Wilde in his jacket, which he then kind of gives away to other people, and that becomes evidence that's used against Wilde at the trial. So obviously this is devastating for Wilde. Wilde is also part of the kind of aestheticism movement and the kind of decadence as well, so he kind of rebels against the kind of Victorian ideas of kind of morality and literature having to have a kind of moral and to instruct us, and is very much interested in the idea of art for art's sake, and lived this kind of hedonistic kind of lifestyle really. Being in prison was an awful experience for him. The conditions were particularly terrible at that point in time, but he had then a second jailer later on in his imprisonment who was willing to let him write and who let him have pen and paper in order to be able to write a letter. So in theory he's writing a letter to Robbie Ross, who's his literary executor, but the audience for this is also Bosie. Okay, there's a kind of personal element to it. Some people see it as being kind of like a love letter, but whilst it's also a love letter, it's also kind of a letter of recrimination, because Bosie's kind of stood against him in the trial. He was sort of forced into it. He basically either had to be implicated alongside Wilde or to accuse him, so he kind of accuses him. So he's writing to Bosie, he's writing to Robbie Ross, and in that sense it's a letter. But in terms of the gap, it's also partly autobiography. It's very much Wilde kind of reflecting on his life and who he wants to be. Okay, so we've got Bosie and Robbie Ross, so we've got that personal audience, but of course Wilde is also writing this and editing it knowing that it's going to be published. Okay, so he knows there's going to be public consumption, and he is very much writing for his critics. Okay, so he would have taken a lot of flack for the kind of lifestyle that he led, particularly his homosexuality, and he's kind of, in this extract, he's quite defiant about that and the way that he's been treated. There will also, of course, be lots of fans of Oscar Wilde. So he's an incredibly popular playwright, a very well-known figure, a kind of celebrity of his day, and so they're part of the audience for it as well. The purpose is also quite varied. Okay, so in one sense, you know, he's writing this for himself, like he's another audience too, and in that sense the purpose is this like cathartic expression. He's trying to get himself to a place where he can kind of accept everything that's happened to him and who he is. He's also writing it to express his feelings to Bosie and to the people who've criticised him. He's also writing it to kind of challenge the whole of society and the way that they've treated him, and he is lastly writing it just to kind of convey information about his life, to kind of justify the way that he has behaved and the things that he's done. So I would say in terms of the overall voice there, it's unapologetic, it's defiant, and it's simultaneously kind of confessional and reflective, and there's this hope for self-realization that's not necessarily actualized yet. So let's look at this first paragraph and think about that kind of element of self-realization. So he starts off by saying, I want to get to the point where I shall be able to say quite simply and without affectation that the two great turning points in my life were when my father sent me to Oxford and when society sent me to prison. So I think there's two main things to take out of the voice there. The first thing is that he starts off by foregrounding it with I want. What that does is it makes it clear that this is a desire, it's an aspiration, it's not something that's realised yet. Now there's ways you can see that. Perhaps there's a bitterness in it. It'd be understandable for Wilde to be bitter at this point in his life. But there's also a hope. So he wants to get to the point where I shall. Okay, and that modal suggests a kind of hopefulness that he really wants to be able to have this kind of self-realization. The second really important part here is this idea that when my father sent me to Oxford and when society sent me to prison, so we've got a kind of balanced clause there. So there's a parallelism, a syntactical parallelism, but what he's suggesting, the meaning is that there's no agency for him. He's an object. First of all, his dad decided he was going to go to Oxford University, and then society have controlled his life and sent him to prison. Now, another thing that Wilde is really good at is these kind of paradoxical statements. And whilst it's not a paradox, there's definitely an imbalance, isn't there, between being sent to university and being sent to prison. They're not two ideas that kind of align with each other. But the way that they're put in that balanced clause makes the statement seem like they've got equal weight. So he's sort of suggesting that being sent to prison is the same as being sent to university. And I think that parallel comes from the fact that in both circumstances, he had no agency over his life. The other little thing to notice is this adverbial phrase, quite simply and without affectation. So that's his aspiration, really, that if he could say that the two great turning points in my life, if he could create equity between being sent to university and being sent to prison, then that would feel like acceptance, that, and without affectation means naturally. Okay, so this is how acceptance would feel to him. There's also a kind of power that comes through in the next sentence. I will not say, so look at that modal, there's a sense of certainty, that prison was the best thing that could have happened to me, for that phrase would savour of too great bitterness towards myself. There's an understatement there, isn't there? Obviously, prison is not the best thing that could have happened to him. But in terms of what he's trying to suggest about kind of acceptance and self-realization, he's trying to suggest that perhaps there's a goodness in being sent to prison because it's made him reflect on his life and reflect on society. However, what he says, well, he can't say that because that would be too bitter towards himself. Okay, so we've got that sensory metaphor there of too great a bitterness. That's important because we know that in aestheticism it was all about kind of those sensory experiences, and there's an element of kind of hedonism and the decadent movement that Wilde was also a part of. So that kind of sensory metaphor fits into those kind of contextual elements. The reflexive pronoun towards myself is also interesting there. Okay, so this is very much fits with the kind of self-reflective tone, the kind of confessional tone of it, that he's inwards looking. He's kind of reflecting on what's happened to him and who he is. And then he continues, I would sooner say, or hear it said of me, that I was so typical a child of my age, that in my perversity, and for that perversity's sake, I turned the good things of my life to evil, and the evil things of my life to good. So some really interesting things to unpick in there. Okay, first of all, we've got this little subclause here, or hear it said of me. Okay, now in terms of context, that's important. He was a very famous man who, these rumours came out, his trial would have, everybody would have known about it. So this sense of kind of his public image, he's just showing awareness of that, really. Okay, that almost who he thinks he is seems to kind of matter little compared to who society says he is. This little bit links into context too, that I was so typical a child of my age. So there he's kind of talking about that fin de siècle decadence, and that he was very much a part of that. When he goes on trial and is found guilty, that causes, because he's been such a figurehead for that kind of for the decadence and the aestheticism, that whole movement stops really, and then later on kind of emerges, kind of changes and emerges as modernism. So people very much don't want to associate themselves with it after Wilde's trial. But he's recognising that he is a part of that kind of culturally. And then he continues that in my perversity, now we need to be careful with this because it's not sexual perversity. What he's talking about is kind of contrariness, unreasonableness. And for that perversity's sake, so suggesting that maybe he kind of had a drive to go against expectations, to do things differently. There's a rebelliousness there, isn't there? And then we get this beautiful kind of parallel phrasing. I turn the good things of my life to evil and the evil things of my life to good. That's like classic Wilde, the way that he kind of gets that antithesis in there. So antithesis, remember, two things contrasting. I think he's saying that the good things of his life, his marriage and his family, his wife did stand by him, become something that's evil because they get corrupted through the trial. And then he's turned the evil things of his life, obviously his love for men is seen by society as a sort of social evil at this point in time, which is so tragic. But for him, he's turned those things to good. Now there's a real defiance in that statement when we realise that that's what he's saying. He's kind of standing up for his sexuality. It's also worth noting within the overall text structure that each of these paragraphs ends with a profound statement. Okay, and I've highlighted those in green. That's the first example of that. So he continues in the second paragraph to say, what is said, however, by myself or others. So we've got another reference there to the kind of rumours in his public image. Matters little. So we've got that kind of heightened language. That it's an irrelevance. The rumours are an irrelevance. And then he kind of tries to frame that in terms of what he needs to do for his own self-actualization. The important thing, the thing that lies before me, the thing that I have to do if the brief remainder of my days is not to be maimed, marred and incomplete, is to absorb into my nature all that has been done to me, to make it part of me, to accept it without complaint, fear or reluctance. So let's talk first of all about what he means here. Okay, so he's saying that in order for him to be able to kind of live his life without being completely miserable, what he has to do is accept what's happened to him. So to accept being sent to prison and the way that he's been treated by society. Let's pick apart the language a little bit more. Okay, so he starts off with this incrementum. So that's when something gradually increases. So the important thing, so look at the repetition here, the thing that lies before me, the thing that I have to do. So with each of those phrases it builds, okay. We've got some kind of repeated phrasing, haven't we, in the important thing, and then we've got some anaphora when it becomes the thing that, okay. What that anaphora and that incrementum does is it really builds this kind of profound dramatic voice and makes us realize just how important this is to him in terms of accepting what's happened to him, accepting the kind of harshness of his life and the cruelty of society. That dramatic voice is reinforced with things like if the brief remainder, okay, that's maybe a bit hyperbolic. He doesn't know how much longer he's going to live. But it certainly gives it this kind of dramatic tone. It kind of gives us a sense of how important this is to him. It's like his whole soul is on the line. He has to be able to do this. And then we get this triad, is not to be maimed, marred and incomplete. So again, the triad fits with that kind of poetic, profound voice. But this is all to do with kind of like illness and disability. And so that is really emotive. It makes us realise just how profoundly awful this is for him if he can't accept it. It's also interesting to note that this is in the passive voice, and that kind of fits with the idea of him not having agency over his life, of this is something that's happened to him. And that's reinforced with all that has been done to me. Okay, so he's got no kind of control, it's happened to him. It's also interesting that he uses this metaphor to absorb into my nature, that he has to kind of, it gives it that confessional element, doesn't it? And also reinforces that poetic voice. And we get another triad then as well, to make it part of me. So really what he's emphasising here is how important this is for his identity. To accept it without complaint, fear or reluctance. Okay, so what that triad does is it again emphasizes this profound voice, but it really shows how he has to have this kind of this calmness if he wants to be if he wants to have any kind of happiness. He just has to not be bitter about it, which is obviously a really difficult thing to do. And then we get this really kind of profound ending at the end of the next paragraph as well. The supreme vice is shallowness. Whatever is realized is right. So interesting to note those simple declaratives, they make it seem really powerful, like this is something that you definitely can't argue with. We can say that these are like axiomatic conclusions, okay, because they're kind of beyond the realms of logic. They just are, okay, beyond the realms of reason, sorry, rather than logic, that there's things that are. The idea that the supreme vice is shallowness is a really interesting one. We might think that it's kind of it's evil, or it's greed, or one of the 7 deadly sins, but what he's suggesting here is that it's shallowness, that it's a lack of depth or a lack of character that is somehow the supreme vice, which definitely fits into kind of Wilde's sense of asceticism and the artist being important, and the fact that, you know, it's about the kind of life that you live, and that there's a truth and authenticity in that, which is very kind of forward-looking, almost 21st century ideas. Obviously, there's a sense that this is maybe targeted at Bosie, who was quite shallow, who expected Wilde to kind of pay for his very flamboyant lifestyle and often didn't treat him particularly well. But potentially he's also targeting it at the whole of Victorian society. You know, in A Picture of Dorian Gray, his novel, he's very much looking at the hypocrisy of society. And I think obviously the hypocrisy of society, you know, there's lots of sin in Victorian society and this veneer of propriety over the top of it. And obviously he has kind of fallen on the sword of that, because his sexuality has become something that's been labelled as corrupt, and he's been sent to prison for it, whereas, you know, the whole of Victorian society was kind of rife with corruption. And then we get this second declarative, whatever is realised is right. Now I think that's a reference to Pope, a poet before Wilde, who said whatever is right. Now, very simplistically, what he's saying there is, you know, he had a belief in a Christian God, and he's suggesting that, you know, whatever happens, regardless of whether or not it feels right, it is right, because God is in control of everything. Well, actually, Wilde's challenging that. He's being really defiant. He's saying whatever is realised, whatever we come to learn through our personal experience, is right. So that kind of strips away all of the authority of kind of like God and society, and makes it very much a kind of personal morality, if you will. Let's look at this last paragraph then. When I was first put into prison, some people advised me to try and forget who I was. It was ruinous advice. Okay, so here he's obviously talking about his sexuality, to try and forget who I was, but, you know, he talks about it in bigger terms than that as well, that it obviously his sexuality is such a big part of his identity, but obviously at the time, you know, it's not it wouldn't have been acceptable to have spoken about it, so he kind of uses these generalized terms. And look at that simple declarative, it was ruinous advice, okay? And what he's saying there is that we have to be authentic, we have to be true to ourselves, otherwise we are just on a path of self-destruction. It is only by realising what I am, so again, he doesn't label his sexuality, he leaves it ambiguous. Although anybody who's reading this at the time and afterwards is going to be aware that that's what he's saying, but it's almost kind of euphemistic, isn't it? And that's partly the ambiguity comes from the times, really, because of how shameful it would have been seen to be. And he's saying that it's only by realizing what I am that I have found comfort of any kind. So really, by talking about only and any there, he's really kind of giving it that sense of drama again, that it's only that he's got a little bit of comfort. Okay, he's still in this real place of turmoil. That's what we understand by reading this, that there's minimal comfort, that, you know, his life is still incredibly difficult, not just literally being in prison and it being hard, but also just in terms of that authenticity of self. Now, I am advised by others, so there's that link to being advised before. Some people advise me, so we've got that lovely text cohesion, you know, his sentences are so beautifully formed. To try on my release, to forget that I have ever been in prison at all. I know that would be equally fatal. So here, that's hyperbolic, isn't it? It's not, well, I mean, in the sense it kind of profoundly doesn't turn out to be hyperbolic, because he does die of tuberculosis quite soon after he gets released from prison. You know, his mental health and his physical health is so poor, but he doesn't know that at that point in time. You know, he is talking in hyperbolic terms. And what that does is it gives it that kind of very dramatic voice. Now, that whole section that we've just looked at, I've put here that he's really critiquing society's hypocrisy, you know, saying just forget what's happened to you, forget who you are, forget your experiences. And actually the argument that he's making is one of defiance. We can't just forget these things. We have to be true to ourselves and acknowledge them. And it kind of links into this: whatever is realized is right. We have to really think about what our life experiences are and come to accept them. It would mean that I would always be haunted by an intolerable sense of disgrace. I mean, that metaphor really kind of sums up the overall effect for him on his sense of identity, doesn't it? That he has to accept who he is, accept that he's been sent to prison. Otherwise, he is going to live the rest of his life in kind of misery, thinking that there's something shameful about who he is. I mean, it is just tragic that, you know, this is how people would have felt. And then we get this beautiful little bit of kind of poetic voice that comes through, and that those things that are meant for me as much as for anybody else. Now, that's really defiant. He's kind of challenging society here. The beauty of the sun and moon, the pageant of the seasons, the music of daybreak and the silence of great nights, the rain falling through the leaves, or the dew creeping over the grass and making it silver, would all be tainted for me and lose their healing power and their power of communicating joy. So here we get this beautiful list, don't we, which is put really poetically, of all the things in the natural world, all the joys of the natural world that he wants to experience. Now, the parallel phrasing here, the beauty of, the pageant of, the music of, the silence of, okay, really gives it that sense of kind of profundity and beauty. So the kind of his sentence structure and his use of literary techniques was really kind of creating for us the kind of grandeur of the world and the joys of nature. It very much fits into the kind of romantic poets as well, who would have kind of experienced joy through the natural world and through the sublime. But we've got metaphors like the music of daybreak, the personification, the dew creeping over, and personification here, their power of communicating joy. So I think that very much gives it that kind of poetic voice, and I think helps it have that kind of reflective air. So we move kind of from defiance to sort of this reflective beauty, and then we finish with this parallel phrasing in these balanced phrases as well. To regret one's own experiences is to arrest one's own development. So what he's saying here is that we can't obviously regret our experiences, or we can't become who we were supposed to be. And really, I suppose he's justifying his behaviour, the way that he acted, not just about his sexuality, but the way that he lived his life in a sort of hedonistic way. He's saying, well, do you know what? We can't regret that, or we're never going to become the person we were meant to be. I mean, there's a real tragedy in the next declarative. To deny one's own experiences is to put a lie into the lips of one's own life. So again, we've got the metaphor there, which I hadn't labelled for you. I mean, what he's saying is that if we can't be true about who we are, then we just destroy our own lives. And I mean, it's what's happened to him. Society has basically destroyed his life. And then he finishes with this bold declarative: it is no less than a denial of the soul. So that if we are inauthentic about who we are, then we kind of destroy our entire soul. And it's a real kind of sense of profound realization, self-realization, I would say, at the end here, but it comes with this air of defiance, because he's setting himself in opposition to Victorian society's attitudes towards sexuality. Again, we can say these are axiomatic conclusions, okay, because they're made as these kind of pure statements that you can't argue with.